Okay, today we're going to be on lecture 16. We're going to talk about MVC. This is going to be a good lecture for the challenge that I'm just about to release. I plan to release that after the lecture today. I actually have a GitHub link. So if you go to this GitHub link, okay, this is what you're going to see. Now, the master branch is technically the before class content. Okay, but I also created additional branches. So you'll see an after class, which we'll have once we're finished. And then you'll see a before class, which is what we're going to use. And then you'll see a during class. Actually, I cloned all of them the same. So during class is actually the same as all of them. So master, after class, before class, during class are all the same. However, when we're done, the during class will be modified and the after class will be updated. So if you ever need to come back and pull the code, make sure you're on the after class branch. That'll be the most updated code. So what you'll do is you'll go to the GitHub, click the green button, copy this URL, open up VS Code or go to your terminal. Okay, it doesn't really matter. I'll open up terminal now so I don't mess up my VS Code. CD wherever you want to put the lecture. So I have a lectures directory for 4830. Okay, so CD into your lectures directory. And then I made a directory called lecture 15 MVC, lecture 15 MVC. So CD into that. And then you can do a git clone. Git clone, paste the URL, hit enter. And now it's going to clone the master branch. This is on the local. That's correct, Liv. This is on the local. Today will be all on the local. You could do it on your server, but we're going to be using VS Code to display and run Angular. So I think the local machine will be actually easier. Okay, local machine will be easier. Let's see if I do a git status after I do my clone. Let's see, CD into it, so it's called MVC lecture. Then do a git status. Okay, so I CD'd into lecture 15 for 4830. I did a git clone. I CD into that clone, do a git status. It's on master. We need to switch over to the during class. So you'll do a git checkout and then switch over to during class. And that's the lecture that we're going to be working on. Or that's the a branch we're going to be working on. Okay, this is on my local. Once you have this set up, you can use, let's say, VS Code, because that's what's really nice with Angular is to use VS Code, although you could use others. I have a lot of students who like other, IDEs. Whatever you choose, that's fine as long as you can implement correctly. But once you have it cloned, you can go to it in your lecture 15. Let's see, it doesn't have everything there. It doesn't have everything there. I may have to update it. Let's see, give me 1 second. It doesn't have everything there. See, the directories are there. I think I had my git file too far in. I didn't have it out enough. So let me do a git commit -a-m. Okay, those directories were not empty before. Okay, I think they're there now. So let me do a git push origin master. Let me see if those are at least up on the master branch now. Okay, they're up on the master branch. Let me update all the other branches really quick. So I'll do a git check out to before class. No conflicts. So let me do a git push before class. Almost done. Looked like my Git directory was too far in. Let me check out to during class. Okay, so not sure how you do it on your machine if you already did a clone, but you should be able to just do a git pull and just pull down. You can pull down master or you can pull down during class. We're going to be working in the during class. Let's see, the during class branch. And now during class branch should have 1 and 2. So if you do a git pull origin during class, it should work. Okay, let me know if that's true or false. Okay, before class to work, try to do a git pull origin during class to work for during too. Okay, so you should have 2 directories now. It looks like I have some empty directories in there that I just made, but that's okay. I can actually remove those really quick. Let me remove those. Doesn't really matter. Those were the ones I was trying to make just now. But let's just clean that up. It looks like there wasn't there anyway. So git push origin during class. Everything's up to date. Okay. So here's what we have. Today we're going to start first with custom MVC. Open this up. So do a clone, git clone with the URL. If you do that now, you don't have to worry about polling. But if you've already cloned it, do a git pull origin during class. And then you should see directory 1 and directory 2. Okay, directory 1 and directory 2. Now, we're going to start with directory 1. We're just going to talk about what MVC is. This should be a review session for you because we talked about MVC in 2830. We also talked about MVC in 3330. So if I open up planet data.json, you'll see I just have some data here. This is going to be like my database. Imagine that I was going to a database and this is what I pulled. Okay, I have, 10 planets or so. And I have information like name, color, radius, and the satellites on those planets. And then here in the HTML file, so this is the CSS, it's just external CSS. In the HTML file, we're actually going to implement MVC here. And this is how I would do it with just basic JavaScript. Okay, with just basic JavaScript. Now you'll want to know what MVC is. So if I come over here to the web and search MVC, and the one that I commonly use is by Apple. Okay, if you search Model View Controller by Apple, it says this document's retired. If you look at the new one, it's the same architecture. In fact, we could go to the new one. It shows the exact same image. So what you're going to see here is you have the view, you're going to have the controller, you're going to have the model. You should remember this from 3330. We also talked about in 2830. You have the view, so let's say I have a button. On the view, you click a button, it goes back to the controller. In our case, our controller is going to be like our TypeScript file. Okay, so the view will be the HTML file, the controller will be a TypeScript file, and then the model will be a service file, which we're going to talk about today if we have enough time. If not, we'll have to get to it next time. But you click a button, that goes over here to the controller. The controller receives that button click and tells the model, update the data. So we're going to be talking about planets today. So the user is going to enter planet information, click add planet. That will go to the controller. The controller will say, okay, the user wants to add a planet, and here's the data of the planet. It's going to give it to the model. The model is going to say, okay, I got the data. I'm going to store that into our database, so to speak. Or it could just be an array. Today we're just going to use an array. We're going to store the planet into an array, and then the model comes back and says, okay, I've added the planet successfully. Here's the new data set. And the controller updates the view, and then shows the user what the new data looks like. Okay, we studied this thoroughly. Can everybody see my screen, this MVC diagram here? Can everybody see this diagram? Okay, thank you, thank you. You should remember this. We went over this thoroughly. If you don't remember it, you need to do some reading. The best reading that I have is from Oracle. It talks about how MVC used to be, and then it talks about how MVC is now. It also has some code. Let's see, this is an old one. Let me search this real quick. This is an old one. I'll post these links on Canvas. Yeah, this is the right one right here. So you'll see how it used to be. It talks about how it used to be. You'll see these dotted lines. It would the view would go to the controller would go to the model, and the model would update the view directly. But that was a bad implementation because they couldn't be independent of each other. So then they talk about the new implementation, which you see right here, which is the exact same thing I just showed you, where everything's decoupled. And this is a really common MVC architecture that's used today. Apple uses it. We're going to use it in Angular, but Angular's MVC is slightly different because it's JavaScript. But conceptually, it's similar. Okay, conceptually, it's similar. In fact, I'm going to post a MVC quiz here soon. The questions from that quiz come from this URL right here. So I'm going to post this in the chat. Maybe you can click on it or go to it. That URL is the most important URL for the MVC quiz that I'm about to post. And if you read that in 3330, then great. If you don't remember it, then make sure you go back and read that. This is very important here. This article is going to be 90% of where the questions come from, although I will still ask you some questions like Angular's MVC. And I'll probably post some links too. I'm not sure which one is a good article. I have to look. But they talk about the model and how it's a service file. And they talk about the view, which is the HTML file. And then they have what's called a view model. Okay, because it's a little bit different with Angular because it's a single page application. So it's really hard to separate that back-end code. I was hoping they showed a diagram here, but this looks like a good article to read. There's one article that I use for this class. I'll have to send the link out later, but you'll want to know the difference between the MVC that I always talk about, which is right here, compared to Angular's MVC. I think there's a few questions about that. I always quiz on this MVC pattern, which is from Oracle. However, Angular is slightly different, so you'll want to know some of the differences. And why does Angular have what's called a view model? Okay, that's a very important thing to read. I believe this is the article, but I'll have to double check. Okay, I'll have to double check. So the diagram's slightly different. Okay, so, that's kind of a quick thing of MVC. Apple has good documentation. Usually the model is the data. Okay, usually the model is the data and the functionality to manipulate the data. So we're about to do planets. I'm going to have a planets array. That's going to be in the model. And then if I add or delete a planet, that functionality is going to be in the model. So the model equals the data. The controller we call the middleman. It usually has event listeners. So it'll have the button click event listeners. And when the model updates the data, it will also have an event listener for it as well. The view, well, that's just your HTML file. That's the user interface. So you have the user interface, the controller has the event listeners, and the model has the data and the functions to manipulate the data. You're going to see that. You probably saw questions like that on the midterm. You're going to see that on the quiz coming up, and you're going to see that on the final exam. This is going to be tested everywhere. The view, so you want to write this down. The view is the user interface. It has the buttons. It has the drop downs. It has the UI elements. Whenever you click a button, the controller has the event listeners. So it's going to have an event listener. the event listener gets activated, which is like an on-click event, and then that's going to tell the model to say add a planet. The model is the data and the methods to manipulate the data. So whenever I click the add button, the controller receives that event, tells the model to update, model updates the data, comes back, tells the controller that it's been updated, and then the controller will update the view. The model will never update the view directly. There's no arrow here. It's always going through the middleman, which is we call the controller. So the view is the UI, controller is the event listeners, the model is the data, and the methods that manipulate the data. Okay, you're going to see that over and over again. If you have questions on it, let me know. So first, let's just look at a basic MVC implementation here in custom MVC. I'm going to be looking in JavaScript. You're going to see this is old school JavaScript. This is just plain JavaScript here. When the DOM is finished loading, this function is going to be executed. Now remember, the controller is the middleman, so it handles the information being sent from the view and to the model. Two-way communication there. So you'll see I'm creating an instance of controller. Controller handles the connections between the model and the view. If I come back here, you'll see the view knows nothing about the model. The model knows nothing about the view. It's all happening in the controller. So the controller handles the communication between these two and also handles the instantiation. You remember what instantiation is? That's where you create your objects. So it handles the connections between these two and the instantiation between these two, which is what you're going to see on that first line. Now, this is two-way communication. Okay, this is two-way communication between each one, and the model never talks to the view directory. So here, directly, you'll see here the controller creates the model. We're passing the data to the model. It also creates the view. And then you'll see here I just set view, which just shows the view. Okay, we actually have a set view method here. So the set view calls a function that takes the view type, and then it renders the display with the data and the view type. Now we need to create a function here for the controller. Okay, we need to create a function here for the controller. So if you remember in JavaScript, functions are actually what we call, what the textbook calls is first-class citizens, which means a function pretty much acts as a class. If I create a function, it's going to act as a class, and I can actually instantiate it, okay, which is what we're about to do here. Let's see, something's going on here. Let me see, hold on a second. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a function. Okay, I'm going to create a function. We're going to call it controller. Okay, controller takes two parameters. It takes the model and it takes the view. Okay, takes the model, takes the view, and then we're just going to set them. So I'll say this dot model equals the model pass. This looks like a lot like Java code. You remember that this keyword references the current object. Okay, you'll see Angular also looks a lot like Java code. Okay, so when I instantiate this controller, it just takes the model passed and the view passed and sets those. So it's instantiating them, so to speak. Okay, then you see I call the set view method up here. It just renders the view. You'll see I also have an event listener called add data. So whenever you click the button, this function is going to get executed. And look what it does. It tells the model to add the data, and it passes the data from the view. And then it tells the view to render the new data. Okay, so remember the controller is the middleman. So if I come back, when I click a button, add data, it passes the data to the controller gets the data, tells the model what to do, then the model notifies that it updated, and then the controller updates the view. The model never updates the view directly, which is what you're going to see here. when I call the add data function, I tell the model what to do, and then I tell the view to update with the new data. Okay, you'll see I have called add planet. We're going to add a planet called Pluto. So whenever they click the button, it's going to add this planet here, Pluto, and we're just going to print out some information to see what's in the model and what's in the controller. If I keep scrolling down, we actually need to create the model. So I'm going to create a function called model. Model takes in data, and I'm just going to set it as a global variable. This data equals to data. Now what's really funny here is I just create a function called model, but you'll see up at the top, I'm going to block your view for a second, I'm actually instantiating model here. Okay, because that's JavaScript. It's very loosely typed. That's why they came out with TypeScript, because it's more strict. In TypeScript, you have classes. You also have classes in JavaScript, but JavaScript's very loosely typed, so I can use a function as a class. So even though this says function, technically this is my model class. Now I have the model, the view, and the controller all in one file. This is commonly not a good practice. In most practices, each of these components, the model, view, and controller, will be in separate files. And we're going to see that in the Angular implementation. Here, I just want to show you a quick example of MVC. Having all the separated components, yes, they're in one file. Yes, that's not a good practice, but this is just a quick prototype so we can get to the Angular implementation, which will use the correct practice. You'll see the model has also an add data function. So the controller tells it what to do. Okay, so if I come back here, I'm switching around a lot. Sorry about that. Add a button. The controller says, okay, I'm going to add the data. It passes the data to the model. Model actually adds the data into the data structure, whatever you're using, and then it should send some message back saying, hey, I've been updated. Or it can also send the data back. Controller gets the data and then updates the view. Now remember, MVC is nothing super fancy. All it is a communication structure. It's an architecture pattern. So it's how you set up your code. Okay, so the view is just your front end code, the controller is the middleman, the model is your data. It's just how you organize your code. That's all this is. It's an architecture. It's a system design. It's a design pattern. And it specifies how the communication will occur between each of these three components. So the model adds the data. You'll see it pushes the data that was passed from the controller. Okay, and nothing too fancy there. We just push the data. Once the data is pushed, we pass the data back to the controller. Controller updates the view. Okay, so nothing fancy with the model there, although the model can get complex. In this case, we only have add data. So remember, the model is the data and the functions that manipulate the data, which is what you're going to see here. So I only have one function. I have one CRUD operation, which is create. In most cases, you'll have all CRUD operations. You'll have create, read, update, and delete. Okay, I'm also going to create my view. View does not have anything passed to it, but I am going to set the render mode. The render mode is going to be equal to system. We're going to look at this here in a second, and you'll really see it function. You'll really see it operate in the Angular app because we can change it dynamically much easier. You'll see the view basically has one function called render. It takes in the data and the render mode. Okay, so you'll see the render mode. If it's set, good. Otherwise, we'll have a default value. So if it's list, you'll see it creates an unordered list. If it's table, it's going to create a table. And if it's system, okay, you're going to create divs. Divs with colors, and they're actually going to be circles. You'll see we have a radius. Okay, and it pins it to this. It pins it to the body. So we'll just go over this first one here, list. You'll see I created an unordered list dynamically with JavaScript called the create element. And then if I have any data, I'm going to have a for loop. I'm going to go through all the data, create a list item. You'll see for the list items enter HTML, I pass the name, and I pass a string has a radius of with the radius value, followed by the unit, kilometers, and dynamically set the satellites with the keyword satellites. Then I'm going to pin the list item to the unordered list. You'll see I'm going to query the body selector. I'm going to remove everything from the body and then append my unordered list. So that's all that you're going to see. So if I go from system or list to table, essentially this while loop at the very end will remove the list and then add the table. So that's why you see that while loop there on each of them. That basically just removes everything and adds what we created. So we can see this stay run. If I save it and then I try to open it up in a browser. Okay, so if I open up this HTML file in a browser, I'm going to open up in Chrome. You're going to see this here. This is the system. So it has Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Okay, if I come back over here, and if I switch this, let's say to list, which was the first one we just reviewed, saved it, do a refresh. Okay, do a refresh, you're going to see the list item. If I switch it to table, okay, you'll see the table. Do a refresh, here's my table view. Okay, so the view can dynamically generate based off what the user selects. In this case, the user is not able to select. They will be able to in the Angular app. And here we also call the add data function. So if we want to add the data, we actually need to call that function. So if I come back up to the top, I don't really have a button here, although we will in the Angular app. I'm going to call the add planet function. Okay, so let's see. Add planet is where? Okay, add planet is just a function here. Usually that would be like on a button click. So if I call add planet, let's just imagine I had a button click there. I'm back in the onload. I call add planet. Come back here to do a refresh. You'll see Pluto was added successfully. Okay, Pluto was added successfully. If I switch it back to system, okay, I'm kind of moving around a lot. If I switch it back to system, do a refresh, you'll see Pluto was added to the list. Okay, and I added that add planet here. You could also call the controller. So I could comment this out. I can say app, which is my controller, dot add planet, and I could pass Pluto into it. So I can actually copy this data here and pass it in. So if I want to call it from the controller, like a button click, I can also call it from the controller. So I refresh the page. Now let's see, it's not app.addPlanet, it's actually app.addData. Refresh the page, you'll see Pluto comes back. Okay, so you see each component here. Now, again, this usually would be in separate files. So I'd have my controller, and then I'd have my model in a separate file, and then I'd have my view in a separate file. In this case, I just want you to see each component and how they communicate with each other. So what we just did here, although it's hard to see because there's a lot of functions here, there's a lot of prototypes. Essentially, these prototypes, we talked about them in 2830, but you'll see I'm accessing the controller class. It says function, but this is like our class. This is like our constructor. Imagine this is our constructor for a class. So I'm calling the class, and I'm going to add a prototype, which basically just means add a function. So I'm going to add a function to that class called setView, and this is what the function is equal to. It's an anonymous function, although it has a name now called setView. I'm passing an anonymous function to the setView, which will render the display. Okay, so it takes the data, takes the view type, and tells the view to update with the new data. So the code may look confusing, but really all it's doing is exactly what we showed in the slides. So if I come back, or not the slides, I guess this diagram here. If I come back, I called up here at the top, I called the app.addData. Imagine I clicked a button, that went over here to the controller and called the addData function. The addData function passes the data to the model. The model then adds it to the data. Once it adds it, it passes the data set back to the controller. Controller then updated the view. And how did it update the view? It just called the view render function, and it rendered with the new data set. If the user added another planet, controller will just receive that planet, tell the model to update. Model gets the planet, adds it to the list, returns the data set. Controller then updates the view. Okay, and that's exactly what you'll see here. Now let's look at the Angular version so we can actually see it implemented separately, and I think it'll be a little bit easier to follow. At first, we're just going to set up a view and a controller. If we get that working properly, we're going to separate it into the model, which is a service file. And that's exactly how you should implement the challenge. If you have all three components at the beginning, it'll be hard to implement and you may have a lot of bugs. So what I recommend to do is start simple, just have the view and have the controller, which is what an Angular app initially is. The view is the HTML file, the controller is the TypeScript file. Then once you get that to work, separate it into what we call a service file. Again, a service file is a TypeScript file, so it makes it a little confusing. That's why the Angular MVC is slightly different. They call it a view model, but this service file will act as our model. It will be a separate file. We can put model in the name so it's not confusing, and then that will handle the data. So let's take a look. If I switch over number 2, this is actually, I have my node modules here, so you actually need to go into the directory. Okay, so if I'm in the during class lecture, let me do a git status. We actually updated, so let me go ahead and commit this. I'm going to do a git commit -m updated custom MVC. Okay, I'm going to do a git push origin. What's that called? During class. Okay, so if you miss some of that code, you could always do a poll now and you'd get the updated code. But what you need to do is cd into directory number 2, do an ls, cd into Angular MVC, and then before you can run this app, you need to do an npm install. That way you get your node modules. So do an npm install. For mine, I already have the node modules, but do an npm install so you can run this thing with me later. You should have no issues. If you have issues, let me know. Okay, so cd into number 2, do an npm install. Cd into number 2, cd into Angular MVC, and then do an npm install. Okay, then do an npm install, and then if I do an ls, you should see node modules there. Once node modules are there, you can implement with me. So let's take a look at this code. First things first, if you open up index.html, so go into the source, open up index.html. This is just a regular Angular app. I've done nothing and have no modifications in the index file, which is how most Angular apps are implemented. The only exception would be if you have your no script tags here, like we did in challenge 3. But in most cases, the user will have JavaScript enabled, and this index file will not be modified. Then, if I open up the assets directory, you'll see in our custom MVC, I had one called planetdata.json. With a regular JavaScript app, I can just have that in the same directory. You'll see this is in the old directory. You don't need to switch back. I'm just going to show you. And then all I do is call a script tag here and add it. For an Angular app, where it's going to be is in the assets directory. So whenever I do a ng build, all these other directories go away. You don't have the app directory anymore. You don't have the components directory anymore. The only thing you're going to have is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with the assets directory. So the assets directory is where all the data should go. So I open up that assets directory, you'll see planet.json there. And that's exactly where I have the information which we had before. So for your app, which you're about to do, MVC, make sure if you have any data that needs to be included, which you will, it needs to go in that assets directory. Otherwise, it will not compile when you do an ng build. If I open up app, you're going to see a few components here. I have home page. I also have page not found. You'll see I have routing enabled. So if I open up routing modules, you'll see I basically just have a home page, and I redirect to the home page if no page is specified, and then I just have a page not found. Okay, page not found. Let's see, I have some errors here. Not sure what that error is. Anybody else see these errors, or is that just me? Let's see, let me open up app module. Why would I have an error in app module? Anybody else see this error, or is that just me? Let me try to do a ng serve. Before we write any code, let's do an ng serve and see if it compiles. Let's see, Nick says, yeah, I got some errors. I hope I didn't mess anything up when I put that git file in the back. Let me close out this one. Let me try it again. Try to do an ng serve before we add any code and see if you get any errors. Before you do an ng serve, make sure you do an npm install. Let's see, Avery, do you need to init an ng app? I did before. I moved the .git file out of this directory into the parent directory. You shouldn't have to init it because I did already. It looks like it compiled successfully. I'm not sure why that error is showing up, but if it compiles, let me click it. You should see this page here, which is what shows on my page. So try to do an ng serve. You don't need to do a init because I did that already for you. That's why I wanted you to download the GitHub directory. That way we're all in the same Angular version. That way we're all in the same Angular CLI version. And I already initialized the app. If you do an ng serve, you should get this page, which means the app is working correctly. I'm not sure why VS Code is showing these errors, but it could have been because I moved the Git file out to the parent directory. That just may say that that I need to update these files. That may just be a Git thing. It doesn't recognize these files. I need to add them again. Okay, in the home page, here's our MVC. Now we've been implementing the view and the controller all along. So if I open up the HTML file here, this is my view. And if I open up the TypeScript file here, this is my controller. Okay, this is my controller. Let's see, source. Let me see if this has changed. It should not have changed. If I do source, app, VS Code is giving me problems. Source, app, what was it, services. Why is that not working? What's weird is it compiles. I'm not sure why VS Code is showing this here. I may need to close VS Code out. I did some modifications while it was running. Let me close VS Code out. Let me do a git status. Looks like it's good. I'm going to close this out for a second. Let me reopen it. This is the second time VS Code has done this to us. It messed up on our server. It's also messing up here. I hope VS Code is not starting to break. Okay, I don't get those errors anymore. So I don't know if you guys need to close yours as well. I really don't know what that was. I've never seen that before. But it looks like it's working now. So I just closed VS Code, open it back up, and no issues. Okay, let's keep going. So remember, the view is your HTML file. That's going to be your view. The controller is your TypeScript file. Now you'll see I've imported this service file and I put model in the name. So this service file is going to be your model. If I open it up, you'll see I created a services directory, which is good. Try to create directories. You'll see I have a service directory. This is going to be your model. So any data or methods that manipulate the data will go here. So in your challenge, you'll also create a service file just like this. So in the assets, you'll have your data if you're going to import any, which you will. Then the services will be your model. And then in your pages, this will be your view. This will be your controller. Okay, now we're going to re-implement that page, but it's going to be more dynamic using Angular. So let's first start in the HTML. Okay, let's first start in the HTML, and we're going to start adding this and implementing it with Angular. Okay, it looks like Nick also closed the app, opened it back up. Errors have disappeared, which is good. Okay, in the HTML file, you're going to see I have a div. This is just regular HTML, and I'm going to have a form. And then on this select statement, I'm going to use two-way data binding. Okay, in my previous videos, I kept saying one-way data binding, two-way data binding. And we're actually going to use two-way data binding. And if I go back to the Angular documentation, they talk about it. Okay, if I go to Angular IO, two-way data binding, you could use it with ngModel. Okay, there's basic two ways binding. You can set a specific element property, or you can listen for an event change. So whenever an element changes, the event will occur. So it talks about it here in the documentation using a click, or you could use this two-way data binding. Okay, we're going to do it with the model keyword. So on the select, and a lot of people will use Angular form, so you use a form group. That's okay too. For this, I want to keep it simple so we can look at MVC. I'm not necessarily following the new reactive forms, which is what talks about in the Angular doc. Here, I'm just doing a basic form, and the main focus is on MVC. So here's two-way data binding. Okay, you do what's called the brackets and then parentheses, and I'm going to use the keyword ngModel. Okay, I'm going to do ngModel. This is going to be called selection. Okay, now this is actually an old technique that was used back in even Angular.js. This was one of their first functionality that was built with Angular, having what was called an ngModel, and that can be used as your data. Two-way data binding means when I update it on the view, it'll go to the controller. When I update it on the controller, it will also update the view. That's what two-way data binding means, which is the two-way communication here. So when I do ngModel, I'll have two-way communication from the controller to the view. Now React, you can't do this. Well, technically you could do it. It's just very hard to implement. With Angular, that's what makes Angular so powerful. It has two-way data binding. So it makes Angular very powerful, although Angular is written in TypeScript, so you'll see a lot of developers complain about that. Once you get past this TypeScript, you have two-way data binding. That's a lot more powerful than React. React just has one-way data binding. If you want to send it back up, you have to do some weird hack that's not necessarily easy to do, and it's not really easy to understand. Here it's very simple. I do this special annotation, two-way data binding, update it on the view, it goes back to the controller, updating the controller, it dynamically updates the view. Okay, so I have ngModel here. I'm also going to have a change function. Whenever they do this selection and whenever it changes, I'm going to call the selected function. Okay, my options, you're not going to write anything hard-coded. Everything's going to be dynamic. So I'm going to use an ngFor. Remember, this is a structural directive because you'll see that star there. It's essentially a for loop. I'm going to let the view of views. Okay, and then I'm going to basically dynamically set the view here in the options tag. So I'll do, this is called interpolation. Make sure you know the terminology for Angular. If I'm saying these keywords and you know what it is, that's because those are the students who read the Angular tutorial. They know what a structural directive is. They know what interpolation is because they read the tutorials. If I'm saying these keywords and you don't know what they mean, you need to go back and read those tutorials. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time as we continue through the semester. Then I'm also going to use a one-way data binding with the ng value. Okay, ng value, we're going to call it view. Okay, so if they select that option, I'm going to pass it back to the controller. But I don't necessarily need to update the view because these options aren't going to change very frequently. Okay, now we can print that out. So I just do an ngModel, two-way data binding. Whenever this changes, I'm going to call the selected function. It has a name. So if I ever upload the form to a server, this information would be passed. Although we're not going to upload to a server here, the backend is going to be our TypeScript. This is a single page app. I'm going to have a for loop here that's going to dynamically set the options for me. So you'll see I have an ngFor, that's just essentially a for loop. All it does is basically puts a for loop up here. Okay, so I have a for loop and it'll be for view in views, kind of like a JavaScript for loop. And then it has your opening tag here, and then your close tag will be after the options. Okay, so that's just kind of what it does here. Your opening tag's up here, and it just kind of wraps this option HTML element inside of a for loop. So I could use this view anywhere here. Even though I specified ngFor here, I could use this view before the ngFor, this variable, because it actually puts a for loop and encapsulates this option HTML element. This is the view. Let's go back to the controller. So in the controller, let's see if we can grab this information. So if I go to the controller, what's really nice about Angular is I can just literally put a keyword here called selection. Now usually it's good to give it a type. I'm just going to put selection there, semicolon. This looks funny, right? But the ngModel creates the variable, and then whenever it changes, it's going to set that variable right here. Okay, it's going to set that variable right here. So we had a selected method. Let's take a look at that. So I'm going to call it selected. And all I'm going to do is do a console log for now, just so we can see if we have the value with this dot selection. I have to use this keyword here because I'm inside a function and I want to access this global variable. You'll see it's a class like Java. It implements on init, so this is an interface. We define the method here because in an interface it's abstract. So we have to define the implementation. Really, it's not doing anything for now. That's fine. ngModel has to be case sensitive. This selection has to be case sensitive with the controllers field. This is a class field or a global variable. If it's case sensitive, whenever the model updates, or sorry, whenever the view updates, the controller will also get that value. So I'm running the page over here. Let's see if it works. So I can do a refresh. Let's see, am I not running it? Let's do ngserve. Let's see, I opened it back up. I guess I got a CD into number 2. cd into Angular, and then do an ngserve, since I shut down VS Code and opened it back up. Okay, let's see. We have an error in the homepage component.typescript, homepage component.html template URL. I don't know what I did, but whatever I did when I moved that file out, it really messed up a lot of things here. Actually, I think we're just missing an import here. It says it can't bind ngModel since it isn't a known property of select. So sometimes you'll get some of these weird errors here, and you actually just need to add an import. So if I search this error here, let's see what happens when it comes up in Google. Let's try to search this error. I bet I'm just missing an import here. Okay, Stack Overflow, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. You'll see it says 2,000 upvotes. That's usually a good one. It says, hey, all you're doing is missing this import. I actually left that out to show you this error. So if I go over to the app module.typescript, you'll see I imported it for us. I just didn't add it, so we can see that in some cases you'll get an error with TypeScript or Angular. You literally just search the error here in Google, find a good tutorial. Sometimes Stack Overflow works, sometimes it doesn't. And you'll see here I'm just missing the forms module import. I added the import. We just need to add it into our imports list. So go to app module.typescript and let's add this in here. Forms module. Save it. Run it again. Now it knows the keyword ngModel. Hoping it does. Let's see. I still have some issues here. It doesn't know the keyword views. So let's go ahead and make that real quick. So if I come back to the controller, I'm going to have the variable called views, which is just an array. Okay, the first one's going to be called select1. The second one's going to be called list. The third one's going to be called table. Remember, I updated these in the custom MVC. The next one's going to be called system. And the next one's going to be called all. We're going to add an additional option there. Once I add these, I did double quotes. My prettier, change it to single quotes. It doesn't really matter as long as it recognizes it as a string. Save it. Compiled successfully now that it knows the views. And I'm going to run it on localhost. Now you'll see I do have an options. Okay, you'll see I do have an option, so I can click it. Click on list. If I go to inspect and view the console, let me put this on the bottom so you can still see the page. You'll see it printed out list. Then if I select table, it prints out table. Then if I select system, it also prints out system. So that communication between the view and the controller is working with ngModel. Now this isn't a common practice, but let's just say I updated this. Will it update dynamically? I don't know if I did two-way data binding, but let me do a push. Let me try to do a push with test. Let's see if it updates the view dynamically, just to do a quick test. So I do a refresh. You'll see it's not there, but once I select one, come back, you will see test was there dynamically. Now that's pretty cool. Some of you may not understand, but that is really hard to implement. That's the two-way data binding that I'm talking about. So if I refresh the page, you'll see it's not there. When I make a selection, I can dynamically update the options because I have two-way data binding with the ngModel. Okay, that's what I'm talking about if I come back over here. The view can update the controller. The controller will also update the view. So I do have a true two-way communication. I'm going to comment this out because we don't really need it. I just wanted to show you that it is truly two-way communication. Okay, so this works. Now that I added the import, and now that I have my views, let's keep building. So I'm coming back to the HTML file, and we're going to keep building. So I'm going to use this ngModel throughout all of these here. So let's say I want two-way data binding. Whenever I update the input, it's going to update the controller, but it's also going to update the view dynamically. So let's look at this again with another example. So I'm going to do two-way data binding with ngModel. This was the first functionality that Angular came out with. And I'm going to have form planet name. That's what it's going to be called. You'll see I have a name. I'm also going to add a placeholder here so the user knows what to enter in. I'll just say enter in the planet name. And then right after the input, although this isn't a common practice, I just want to show you what two-way data binding means. I'm going to do form planet name as interpolated value. It's just going to be a paragraph tag. It looks like a string. It's just going to output a string here, and then the browser will put it in like a paragraph tag. Okay, so the browser will handle it for us. We could put it as a span or put it as some formatted element. I just want to show you two-way data binding. Now, when I save it, it's not going to know what it is because we need to update it in the controller. Okay, we need to actually update it in the controller. Okay, before we switch over, let's go ahead and add placeholders for each one. So this is, we want the user to enter the color. On this one, we want the user to enter the radius. And on this one, we want the user to enter the satellites. Okay, you're going to get an error. So I just put some placeholders here. You're going to get an error because the controller doesn't see form planet name, so it's not going to compile. This is why I like TypeScript, because TypeScript is more strict. It sees that there's no variable there, so it's not going to even let you compile the code. And that's why Google likes TypeScript too. Google is kind of Java oriented. They like a lot of Java, although they have other language Go. They come out with a lot of stuff, but the foundation of Google was Java based. And Java is very strict. So if the variable is not case sensitive the same, it's not the same type, you're going to get an issue. And that's why TypeScript was formed. So you can specify types. Now with JavaScript, this would compile. I don't have the variable there. Who cares? JavaScript's very loose. TypeScript, no way. I need to come back over to the controller. And I just make the variable up here. It needs to be case sensitive the same. With JavaScript, if it's not case sensitive the same, it'll still print out. Sorry, it won't print out. It'll still compile, is what I meant to say. It'll still compile. So you see I have the form planet name. I'm just going to add the variable up there at the top for now. Now it compiled successfully. Let me show you how powerful this is. So if I refresh, and if I start typing the planet name, let's say Pluto, look, as I'm typing, it's actually updating the UI because of two-way data binding. Now this looks simple. Oh, it's just updating the UI as you're typing. That's like an on button press. No, this is very difficult to implement, and that's why Angular is so powerful. As I'm typing, I'm using two-way data binding. It's literally going over here to the controller, updating the controller variable, and then coming back and updating the view. Okay, as I'm typing, which is why Angular is so powerful. So it's working. So now we're actually going to go and add a planet. Okay, so I have that two-way communication. If I come back to the view, I'm not going to put them on these. I just wanted to show you could do two-way data binding, which is what you see here. It updates dynamically. We're going to actually have an on-click. So I'm going to use the Angular on-click function called add my planet. Okay, whenever they click the button, this function will get called. Now, I'm going to make that function here in a little bit, so you'll see I get an error. But before I do, I want to show you a pretty cool thing for Angular. You'll see I have a form element here, and then I have the different list views. So I have a list view, table view, system view, and then I'm going to do all. So I can actually put a switch case here. And remember, a switch case is just like a switch case in Java or a switch case in any programming language. Whatever is passed for the selection. So you can imagine this is essentially adding functionality to the front end code, which is why Angular and React is so powerful. Essentially, if I had code here, it'd be like a switch, a regular switch, and I'm passing in selection, and then I have my opening bracket here. That's what this ng switch is doing. It's literally putting functionality in the front end. Normally, you couldn't do this. Normally, you'd have to have JavaScript code and implement the switch and then say what you want to show. With Angular, I can put functionality right in the front end, just like with this structural directive, this ng4. Now I'm putting an ng switch. So if the selection, let's say, equals, I'm going to put a case here. Before I do, let's enter the total planets. So I'll put total planets here. And I'm going to create a function. So not only can I interpolate with a value, I can also interpolate with a function. So I can say get total planets. I'm going to call the get total planets function. I don't have it yet. I'm about to create it. Once we go back to the controller, I'd like to get some more of these elements added before we switch back. And then I can literally create a switch case here. So I'm going to use a structural directive. And I'm going to say ng switch case. This is literally like creating a case statement here in my switch. So I'll have case, and I'll have case where it's equal to list. Okay, if you remember in Java, we did these all the time. So it's literally like putting a case statement here. So I'll do ng switch case, and if the case, it's kind of weird how you have to do this because you have to put a string in here. So I'm going to put spaces here, even though this isn't a common practice. I'm going to say if it's equal to list. I just want to show you, you need the double quotes, but you also need to set it as a string. So I'm kind of mix matching the quotes here. I need these double quotes for the ng switch case, and I need these single quotes to say it's a string. Now that you see that, I'm going to get rid of the extra spaces. Okay, and I'm going to actually specify what's going to happen here. So if it's a list view, instead of writing all that JavaScript code like we saw in the custom, I'm going to use Angular. So I have an under the list, and I'm going to use another structural directive called an ng4, and I'm going to say let p, which is planet, of data. So each planet in the data, I'm going to print out the information. So I'm going to use interpolation p.name. And then remember how we did it in the custom? We said has a radius of space. Then we did planet.radius. And then we followed it by the unit, kilometers. And I'll say and p.satellites. And then the keyword satellites. Now I put this on multiple lines, although it could all be on one line. Maybe it's easier to read on one line here, so I'll leave it on one line. And then we just keep going. I'll make another case for this table view. So if it's the table view, so switch this out with table. So if they select table in the selection, then this one's going to get called. You'll see I'm using just a regular table. I got some styles on there. I hard-coded the columns, so this is the table headers. But the table data is going to be dynamic. And we can make it where it had a double for, so they're both dynamic. But I'm just focusing more on MVC. So I'll go through all the planets again. And in each one, I'll print out the planet name, the planet color, the planet radius, and the planet satellites. Now, why I have number 1 and number 2, because number 1 is custom MVC. We're doing everything we did in number 1 also here in number 2. So they're equivalent. It's just one is just showing a basic understanding. number 2 is actually implementing it in this architecture. So each one has a different file, and then we have the communication, two-way communication between each one. We still had two-way communication in the first example. It's just that it was using regular JavaScript, and also it was all in the same file. So this is a better programming practice. Now we have one more, the system view. Let's finish this up, and then we can actually go into the controller. Actually, we're getting short on time. We'll put the ng switch there, but we're not going to implement it yet because this one takes a little bit of time. So I'm going to do the switch case here, and this one's going to be when it equals to system. But I'm not going to implement it yet, okay, because it's going to take a little bit of time. I actually want to show you something really cool that you can do by dynamically changing the style tags. Angular is so powerful, I can select what style I want based off of a structural directive. Okay, so I just put that switch case there. We're going to implement it later. I want to get this working, so I'm going to come back over here to the controller, and let's at least get it working with the controller and the view. Okay, so underneath this, I'm going to create something called data. Right now it's in our controller. Later it's going to be in the model. Remember, start by implementing it in the controller. Okay, so I'm going to have an array, and I'm going to import the planets from the JSON. And I'm going to show you how to do that because you're going to need to do it on the challenge. Please stop auto-correcting. No, I don't want to use yours. I want to use mine. Okay. Now you're going to see two things here. We actually don't have them yet. First thing is we need to import that JSON file. What I like about Angular and all JavaScript is I can literally import. So if I go into source and import from the assets directory and import planets, what is it called? Planet data. Let's open it up. Planet data.json. So we do planet data.json and then specify what I want to call this JSON. So I'm going to call it planets. It will literally import the JSON and store it into this variable. So it's actually literally going to do like a JSON parse. Okay, so it's going to parse a string into a JSON object, and now planets here will be a JSON object. Let's see, did I misspell it? Planet data.json. Let's see, it was working earlier. Let's see, I did source /assets / planet data.json. Let's see, is planet data in the assets directory? It looks like it is. Anybody having any issues with this? Are you guys getting an error? How did you fix the ngModel error again? You need to create the variables here. I have two variables here, and that's what fixed the ngModel error. I also imported the forms back in app.module. Make sure you import that forms module. Let's see. It looks like on mine, I actually did a relative path here. Let's try a relative path. So let me try this again. If I go back a directory, it looks like go back another directory, go into assets. Let's try it this way. Planet data.json. Okay, still no. Let's see, it's right here. Let's see, I don't think I need these brackets. Maybe that's causing an issue. It's looking for a component. Still an issue. Let's see, can't find module. We're not really looking for a module. We're looking for a JSON file. Where is this error? This looks good. I'm not sure why this is giving me an error. It also does not compile. Let's see. Cannot find module. Consider using resolve JSON module to import module with JSON extension. Am I missing an import? I may be missing an import. Where is that import? I don't know. I need to look for it. We're also missing this interface. Okay, we're also missing this interface. With Angular, you want to specify types, and we're going to specify our own custom type. Remember, the planet had the name, the color, the, what else? Let's go back. Name, color, radius, and satellites. So we can actually create an array of type planets and specify exactly how that planet should go by using what's called an interface. You must use an interface on the challenge. Okay, you must use an interface on the challenge. It looks like we're out of time. I need to go ahead and end this lecture. I will fix this. I'm probably going to record and keep going so we don't get behind. But I'm missing some import. I'll fix that. We need to create an interface for the planet's type. We're going to make our own type, and you got to do that on the challenge, so that's very important. But we're out of time. Put your name and pop print in on the chat. I'd love to keep going, but we got to stop here. I'm going to record some videos. We're going to fix this, get it to work, and then we're going to look at the next example. I'm also going to post a challenge tonight. I know I said that last night as well. I ran into issues with another course's midterm. I apologize for the delay. Right now, look at Angular MVC. Go over the documentation that I showed you, the Oracle documentation. While you're waiting for me, read that documentation because the quiz will be up. And like I said, I'm estimating 90% of the questions come from that Oracle documentation. So make sure you read it and review it so you can do well on the quiz. Okay, that's it for today. Put your name and pop it in on the chat. I'm going to stay here for a few minutes. I have until 5 o'clock. I really need to get this challenge up. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me.
Yeah, Professor.
Hold on one second. Otherwise, we will see you next time.